Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a question that every woman in history had to deal with, but one that surprisingly few history books ever talk about. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people imagine the ancient world, they picture emperors, pyramids, battles, philosophers, and grand monuments. History books are filled with kings conquering neighbouring kingdoms, generals marching across continents, and scholars debating the nature of the universe. Yet one of the most common human experiences in history is almost completely absent from these stories. For thousands of years, women lived, worked, raised families, managed households, travelled, worshipped, and participated in society while dealing with their monthly periods. Every civilization had women. Every civilization had menstruation. Yet surprisingly, few ancient writers bothered to tell us much about it. Part of the reason is simple. Most surviving records were written by men, and many of those men belonged to the educated elite. They recorded wars, taxes, laws, and royal ceremonies. The daily realities of ordinary women rarely received the same attention. If a Roman senator sat down to write a history of his age, he was far more likely to describe a military campaign than explain what his wife or daughter used during her monthly cycle. Apparently, invading Gaul was considered more historically significant than explaining how half the population got through the month. This leaves historians with an unusual challenge. Ancient women experienced menstruation countless times throughout their lives, but direct evidence is scarce. Menstrual products were usually made from materials that decomposed long ago. Cloth rots, plant fibres disappear, wool breaks down. Unlike stone temples or bronze weapons, these objects were never meant to survive for thousands of years. As a result, historians often have to become detectives. They piece together clues from medical texts, religious laws, household writings, artwork, and occasional references hidden in larger documents. Sometimes an ancient physician mentions a treatment. Sometimes a religious rule hints at a common practice. Occasionally, a passing comment reveals more than the author intended. Historians can spend years studying a civilization and become excited over a sentence that essentially translates to, "Women used some cloth for that." Academic life is not always glamorous. What emerges is a picture that is both familiar and surprising. Ancient women faced many of the same concerns that women face today. They needed practical ways to manage bleeding, remain comfortable, continue working, and participate in daily life. A farmer's crops still needed tending. Bread still needed baking. Children still needed raising. Monthly biology has never been particularly interested in people's schedules. At the same time, ancient societies surrounded menstruation with myths, fears, and misunderstandings. Some cultures viewed menstrual blood as powerful. Others considered it dangerous. Some believed it could affect crops, animals, weather, or even metal. Human beings have always possessed a remarkable ability to encounter something they do not fully understand and immediately invent 20 explanations for it. The ancient Greeks, for example, produced philosophers capable of exploring logic, mathematics, and ethics at astonishing levels. Yet some Greek medical theories about the female body sound less like science and more like a group project completed 5 minutes before the deadline. The Romans were not much better. They built roads stretching across continents, engineered aqueducts that still stand today, and organised vast armies with impressive efficiency. Yet some Roman writers sincerely believed that a menstruating woman could dull a blade, spoil wine, and damage crops simply by being nearby. It is almost comforting to know that even highly educated people can occasionally arrive at conclusions that would struggle to survive a modern fact check. As we begin this journey, one thing quickly becomes clear. Menstruation may have been hidden from much of recorded history, but it was never absent from history itself. It quietly shaped the lives of countless women across the ancient world, even when the people writing the history books seemed determined to discuss almost anything else first. The further back we travel into history, the more difficult it becomes to answer a surprisingly simple question. What did women actually use during their periods? Unlike swords, pottery, or jewellery, menstrual products rarely survive for archaeologists to discover. Ancient women were not burying carefully labelled boxes marked monthly supplies for future historians. Instead, the materials they used were usually organic, cloth, plant fibres, animal wool, leather, or other everyday items that gradually disappeared over centuries. As a result, the earliest history of menstruation is something of a mystery. We know women experienced periods tens of thousands of years ago because, well, humanity would not be here otherwise. The challenge is figuring out how they managed them. Imagine a small farming community 6,000 years ago. There are no stores, no pharmacies, and certainly no aisle dedicated to feminine hygiene products. Every solution must come directly from the surrounding environment. Whatever women used had to be practical, reusable, and available nearby. Many historians believe that prehistoric women likely relied on absorbent natural materials. Moss, soft grasses, animal skins, wool, and strips of cloth are all possibilities. Some women may have used nothing at all during lighter days, particularly when spending much of their time outdoors or performing tasks where privacy was less of a concern. This may sound unusual to modern ears, but ancient lifestyles differed dramatically from our own. Clothing was often layered, loose, and designed very differently from modern fashion. In many communities, practical necessity mattered far more than appearance. There is another factor modern people often overlook. Ancient women generally experienced fewer periods than many women today. That statement may sound surprising, but consider the realities of life. Women often married young, had multiple pregnancies, and breastfed for extended periods. Pregnancy and breastfeeding frequently reduce the number of menstrual cycles experienced over a lifetime. While modern women may experience hundreds of periods, many women in ancient societies likely experienced significantly fewer. Of course, fewer did not mean easy. Periods could still be uncomfortable, inconvenient, and occasionally frightening, especially for young girls experiencing them for the first time. Without modern medical knowledge, many societies developed explanations based on tradition rather than biology. Mothers, grandmothers, and older female relatives often became the primary source of information, and in many ways, they were probably more useful than the local wise man. Ancient communities produced plenty of experts eager to explain the mysteries of the female body. The problem was that many of these experts had never actually experienced being female. History is full of confident authorities, and as we will soon discover, menstruation inspired some of the most creative misunderstandings ever recorded. As we move from the shadows of prehistory into one of the world's first great civilizations, the picture becomes a little clearer. Ancient Egypt left behind temples, tombs, medical texts, artwork, and enough written records to keep historians busy for several lifetimes. Fortunately for us, a few of those records offer clues about how Egyptian women managed their periods. Life along the Nile was deeply connected to linen. Linen was everywhere in ancient Egypt. It clothed peasants and nobles alike, wrapped mummies, furnished homes, and served countless practical purposes. If an Egyptian encountered a problem, there was a reasonable chance that linen would somehow become part of the solution. Menstruation appears to have been no exception. Many historians believe Egyptian women used soft strips of linen as absorbent menstrual pads. These could be folded, adjusted, washed, and reused when necessary. Unlike modern disposable products, ancient solutions had to be practical and economical. Throwing something away after a single use was a luxury few societies could afford. This means that managing a period often involved extra washing and preparation. Ancient women had many responsibilities already, and menstruation added another task to a workload that was rarely light. Of course, the Nile provided water, but that did not automatically make hygiene simple. Washing cloth required time and effort, especially for ordinary women who were already busy grinding grain, baking bread, weaving textiles, caring for children, and managing household duties. The ancient Egyptians were surprisingly advanced in several areas of medicine. They understood the importance of cleanliness better than many later societies would. However, this does not mean they fully understood menstruation itself. Like many ancient cultures, the Egyptians mixed practical observation with beliefs that sound rather unusual today. Ancient medical texts contain remedies, treatments, and theories that range from sensible to deeply puzzling. One famous Egyptian medical papyrus even included methods for testing fertility and diagnosing pregnancy. Some of these methods involved grains, herbs, and bodily observations. Others seem to have relied heavily on optimism. To be fair, modern medicine has had the advantage of several thousand additional years of research. Criticizing ancient doctors too harshly would be like mocking someone for not owning a smartphone in 3000 BCE. What is most striking is how ordinary menstruation appears to have been in Egyptian life. Women managed it, adapted to it, and continued their daily routines. The pyramids did not stop being built. The fields still needed tending. Markets remained busy. Life in ancient Egypt, much like life today, had little interest in pausing for anyone's monthly inconveniences. And yet, while Egyptian women were developing practical solutions, another civilization across the Mediterranean was beginning to ask a different question. Rather than simply asking how to manage periods, the Greeks became fascinated with why they happened, and their answers would become some of the most influential and occasionally bizarre theories in ancient history. The ancient Greeks loved explanations. If they saw lightning, they wanted to understand its cause. If they observed the stars, they wanted to map their movements. If they encountered a question about human health, they immediately began developing theories, writing books, and debating one another with great enthusiasm. Unfortunately, enthusiasm and accuracy do not always travel together. When it came to menstruation, Greek thinkers were determined to understand what was happening inside the female body. Their efforts laid the foundations of Western medicine, but they also produced some ideas that modern readers may find difficult to hear without raising an eyebrow. Greek medicine was built around the concept of balance. Many physicians believed the human body contained various fluids, known as humours, that needed to remain in harmony. Illness occurred when this balance was disrupted. Menstruation was often viewed through this lens. Some Greek doctors believed menstrual bleeding helped women remove excess fluids from the body. In their view, it was a natural cleansing process that maintained health and balance. If menstruation became irregular or stopped unexpectedly, they often assumed something had gone wrong internally. This may sound strange today, but it represented an attempt to explain a biological process using the best information available at the time. One of the most influential medical figures was Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. While many writings attributed to him contain valuable observations, they also include theories that modern medicine has long abandoned. For example, Some Greek physicians believed the womb could move around inside a woman's body. Yes, move around. According to this theory, a wandering uterus could drift through the body, pressing against organs and causing various illnesses. If you are wondering how a large reproductive organ was supposedly taking independent walks through the torso, you are not alone. Modern doctors have spent several centuries quietly disagreeing with this idea. To persuade the wandering womb to return home, some treatments involved pleasant smells placed near the lower body and unpleasant smells near the face. The logic was that the uterus would naturally move toward the better scent. This was less a medical procedure and more a strategy one might use to lure a lost cat. Yet despite these misunderstandings, Greek physicians were observing something important. They recognized connections between menstruation, fertility, pregnancy, and overall health. Their conclusions were often flawed, but their questions were surprisingly sophisticated. Meanwhile, ordinary Greek women were probably far less interested in abstract theories and far more concerned with practical matters. Philosophers could spend hours debating bodily fluids, but someone still had to fetch water, prepare meals, weave cloth, and manage a household. And for those women, menstruation was not an intellectual puzzle. It was simply part of everyday life. While Greek philosophers and physicians were busy constructing elaborate theories about the female body, ordinary women had a far more immediate concern: getting through the day. Most women in ancient Greece lived lives centered around the household. Their responsibilities were numerous and often physically demanding. Water had to be carried, grain had to be ground, meals had to be prepared, clothing had to be woven, and children had to be cared for. Unlike a modern office worker, there was no option to send a message saying, "I'm taking the afternoon off." Life simply continued. For a woman living in Athens, Sparta, or one of the countless smaller communities scattered across the Greek world, menstruation was another challenge to manage alongside dozens of others. The household did not pause. The family's needs did not disappear. The goats, unfortunately, remained completely indifferent to human discomfort. Although evidence is limited, historians believe Greek women likely used folded cloths, wool, or other absorbent materials to manage menstrual bleeding. These materials could be washed and reused, making them practical in a world where resources were valuable and waste was minimized. Nothing was disposable. In fact, many ancient households would probably be horrified by modern habits of throwing things away after a single use. An ancient Greek family could find 3 additional purposes for an old piece of fabric before finally considering retirement. Privacy also worked differently in the ancient world. Homes were often crowded, particularly among poorer families. Multiple generations might share relatively small living spaces. This meant women had to develop ways of managing menstruation discreetly within environments where personal space was limited. Fortunately, menstruation was not exactly a rare phenomenon. Women learned from mothers, sisters, aunts, and grandmothers. Much of the practical knowledge surrounding periods was likely passed down through conversation rather than written instruction. While philosophers wrote lengthy discussions about the nature of existence, female knowledge often travelled through experience. And unlike some of the medical texts produced by men, it was usually based on reality. Greek society also placed great importance on fertility and childbirth. Menstruation was therefore closely connected to expectations about marriage and family life. A regular cycle was often viewed as a sign that a woman was healthy and capable of bearing children. This could create additional anxiety when periods became irregular or stopped unexpectedly. Without modern medical understanding, changes in the cycle could be confusing or alarming. Yet despite these challenges, women adapted. They always had. What survives from ancient Greece is not a story of helplessness, but one of practicality. Women found solutions, shared knowledge, and continued with daily life, while scholars debated theories above their heads. And across the Mediterranean, another civilization was watching, learning, and occasionally borrowing Greek ideas. The Romans would inherit many Greek medical theories, but they would also add a remarkable collection of menstrual superstitions entirely their own. As Roman power expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, it brought together millions of people from different cultures. The Roman Empire was enormous, stretching from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt. Yet no matter where a woman lived within that vast territory, one monthly reality remained the same. Periods did not care about the borders of empires. A wealthy woman living in a luxurious villa outside Rome experienced menstruation. So did a merchant's wife in Gaul, a farmer's daughter in Spain, and a shopkeeper in Egypt. Their lifestyles might differ dramatically, but they all faced the practical challenge of managing their monthly cycles. Like the Greeks before them, Roman women likely relied on cloth and wool as absorbent materials. Linen remained common throughout the empire, and soft fabrics could be folded and adjusted as needed. These materials were washable and reusable, making them practical in a society where even wealthy households avoided unnecessary waste. Roman women were accustomed to repairing, reusing, and repurposing household items. Modern disposable products would have seemed astonishingly convenient and perhaps slightly suspicious. Romans generally expected objects to have long careers before retirement. The experience of menstruation, however, varied greatly depending on wealth. A wealthy Roman woman might have servants to assist with laundry and household duties. She had access to cleaner living conditions, better nutrition, and greater privacy. If she felt unwell, she could potentially rest more easily than someone from a poorer household. For ordinary women, life was often far less comfortable. In crowded apartment buildings known as insulae, families lived in tight quarters. Water had to be carried, food prepared, and children supervised. Daily work continued regardless of discomfort. There were no sick days approved by the Roman Senate. In fact, if the Senate had debated the issue, they probably would have spent 6 hours arguing about procedure before accomplishing nothing. Roman society was highly practical in many ways. Women developed routines that allowed them to continue participating in daily life while managing their periods. Markets remained busy. Bread was baked. Clothes were washed. The empire continued functioning. This practical reality is important because it contrasts sharply with what many Roman writers believed. While women were getting on with their lives, some male authors were producing increasingly imaginative theories about menstruation. These theories claim that menstrual blood possessed extraordinary powers capable of affecting plants, animals, weather, and even manufactured goods. In other words, while Roman women were solving real problems, certain Roman intellectuals were busy creating entirely new ones. And as we shall see next, some of those beliefs were so strange that they survived for centuries after the Roman Empire itself had disappeared. If Roman women approached menstruation with practical solutions, many Roman writers approached it with something else entirely: imagination, and not always the helpful kind. Ancient Rome produced remarkable engineers, skilled administrators, and talented architects. These were the people who built roads that survived for thousands of years, and aqueducts that still impress modern visitors. Yet when some Roman authors discussed menstruation, their confidence often exceeded their evidence by a considerable margin. One of the most famous examples comes from the Roman writer and naturalist Pliny the Elder. Pliny was an incredibly curious man who attempted to document the natural world in a massive encyclopedia known as the Natural History. The work contains valuable information about ancient science, geography, and culture. It also contains claims that would make a modern fact-checker quietly lie down for a moment. According to Pliny, a menstruating woman could potentially sour wine, damage crops, dull metal, kill bees, and interfere with various natural processes simply through her presence. At one point, he suggested that certain plants might wither if exposed to menstrual blood. This would have been alarming news for Roman farmers, gardeners, blacksmiths, and apparently bees. The remarkable thing is not that such beliefs existed. Every society develops superstitions. The remarkable thing is how many different powers were attributed to menstruation at once. It was almost treated as a kind of mysterious force of nature. If something went wrong, menstruation could become a convenient explanation. Crops failing. Perhaps menstruation was involved. Wine spoiling. Maybe menstruation again. Unhappy livestock. Somehow menstruation was probably being blamed by somebody. Human beings have always enjoyed finding simple explanations for complicated problems. The Romans were hardly unique in this respect. Many ancient cultures viewed blood as powerful. Blood was associated with life, death, fertility, injury, sacrifice, and religion. Since menstrual blood appeared regularly without an obvious wound, it often inspired fascination and uncertainty. People tend to fear what they do not fully understand. Without knowledge of hormones, reproductive biology, or modern medicine, Romans attempted to explain menstruation using the concepts available to them. Sometimes they observed genuine patterns. Other times they wandered into territory that resembles folklore more than science. What is particularly interesting is that these beliefs often tell us more about Roman fears than about menstruation itself. The female body was performing a perfectly normal biological function. The strange powers existed largely in the imagination of observers trying to make sense of something they did not fully understand. Meanwhile, Roman women still had laundry to do, meals to prepare, and families to care for. The crops, fortunately, seemed to have survived. Yet menstruation was not only surrounded by superstition. In many parts of the ancient world, it was also connected to religion, purity, and sacred traditions. And those beliefs would shape the daily lives of women for centuries to come. As strange as Roman superstitions could be, they were only one part of a much larger story. Across the ancient world, menstruation was not merely viewed as a biological event. It was often connected to religion, purity, sacred spaces, and humanity's relationship with the divine. For many societies, periods carried spiritual meaning alongside their practical realities. This did not necessarily mean menstruation was seen as bad. Modern people sometimes assume that any ancient restriction automatically reflected shame or hostility. The reality was often more complicated. Ancient cultures frequently created rules around many bodily functions, including birth, death, illness, and sexual activity. Menstruation simply became part of that broader system of sacred boundaries. One of the most important facts about life in the ancient world is that almost every experience depended on wealth. Periods were no exception. When historians discuss ancient civilizations, it can be easy to imagine that everyone within a society lived in roughly the same way. In reality, the difference between a wealthy Roman noblewoman and a poor labourer's wife could be as dramatic as the difference between a palace and a cottage, because sometimes it literally was. For wealthy women, menstruation was certainly inconvenient, but they often had advantages unavailable to most of the population. Fine linen was easier to obtain. Private rooms were more common. Servants could assist with household tasks, laundry, and other daily responsibilities. If a wealthy woman felt unwell, she had at least some opportunity to rest. The same could not always be said for ordinary women. Across the ancient world, most women lived demanding lives filled with physical labour. Whether they were farming, grinding grain, carrying water, weaving cloth, tending animals, or raising children, daily work rarely stopped. A period might make the day harder. It did not make the day disappear. Consider a woman living in a small farming village. Before sunrise, she might already be collecting water, preparing food, and organising the household. Throughout the day, there were crops to tend, meals to cook, clothing to repair, and countless other responsibilities. Ancient economies depended heavily on manual labour. The human body was often the most important tool a family possessed. As a result, women learned to adapt. Menstruation became another challenge to manage rather than a reason to withdraw from daily life. Practical solutions mattered far more than philosophical debates. This difference between rich and poor also affected access to medical care. A wealthy household could consult physicians, purchase imported remedies, and experiment with treatments recommended by respected scholars. Whether those treatments actually worked was another matter entirely. Paying more for ancient medicine did not always guarantee better results. Sometimes it merely meant receiving expensive advice instead of ordinary advice. A poor woman, meanwhile, often relied on family knowledge, local healers, and remedies passed down through generations. These traditions were usually based on experience rather than theory. Ironically, they were sometimes just as effective. Perhaps the greatest difference was privacy. A wealthy woman might manage her period in relative comfort. A poor woman often lived in crowded conditions where personal space was limited and daily survival took priority over convenience. Yet despite these differences, women across every social class shared the same basic reality. Whether living in a palace, a city apartment, or a rural village, menstruation remained a regular part of life. And because periods were closely linked to fertility, they carried importance far beyond simple monthly discomfort. In the ancient world, they were deeply connected to marriage, family, inheritance, and the future of entire bloodlines. For ancient societies, menstruation was never viewed as merely a monthly inconvenience. It was also seen as a sign of health, a sign of adulthood, a sign of fertility, and perhaps most importantly, a sign that a woman might someday produce children. This connection shaped countless aspects of life across the ancient world. In societies where family survival depended on future generations, fertility was an enormously important concern. Children provided labour, carried on family names, inherited property, and cared for parents in old age. Without reliable pension systems or retirement plans, most people hoped their descendants would become their security. Ancient financial planning was often little more than, hopefully the children turn out responsible. As a result, menstruation attracted considerable attention. A young girl's first period marked a significant transition. In many cultures, it signalled the beginning of womanhood. Families, communities, and potential marriage partners often viewed it as evidence that a girl was entering a new stage of life. The exact customs varied from place to place. Some societies celebrated the event. Others treated it more quietly. Some incorporated rituals, ceremonies, or special periods of instruction from older female relatives. Regardless of the approach, first menstruation rarely passed unnoticed. Marriage was closely connected to these ideas. Ancient marriages were often arranged with family interests in mind. Love occasionally entered the equation, but parents were generally far more interested in alliances, property, social standing, and future grandchildren. Romance existed. It simply did not always get the final vote. Because menstruation was associated with fertility, Regular cycles were often viewed as reassuring signs that a woman could bear children. If menstruation became irregular or disappeared, families sometimes worried about infertility. Without modern medical knowledge, however, determining the cause was nearly impossible. Ancient physicians frequently blamed mysterious imbalances, dietary problems, emotional distress, environmental factors, or any number of other explanations. Occasionally they guessed correctly. More often they displayed impressive confidence while being completely wrong. The pressure placed upon women could be substantial. In many societies, producing children was considered one of a wife's most important responsibilities. Fertility affected family status, inheritance, and social expectations. Menstruation therefore became intertwined with concerns about the future of entire households. Yet the reality was far more complicated than ancient people understood. Women experienced irregular cycles, health conditions, stress, nutritional challenges, and countless other factors that influenced fertility. Ancient observers often saw the outcome without understanding the underlying biology. Still, generation after generation, families watched for these signs, hoping for healthy marriages and healthy children. And as they did so, countless myths continued to grow around menstruation itself. Some were harmless, some were strange, and some survived for so many centuries that people continued believing them long after the ancient world had disappeared. If there is one thing human beings have always done exceptionally well, it is creating myths. Sometimes those myths explain the stars, sometimes they explain thunderstorms, and sometimes they explain perfectly ordinary biological processes in ways that become increasingly strange the longer you think about them. Menstruation inspired an astonishing number of myths across the ancient world. Part of the reason was simple. People could observe what was happening, but they could not see why it was happening. Without knowledge of hormones, reproductive systems, or modern medicine, societies filled the gaps with stories, assumptions, and speculation. And once a myth became established, it could be remarkably difficult to remove. After all, facts must be learned. Myths merely need to be repeated. Many ancient cultures believed menstruation gave women unusual powers. Unfortunately, these powers tended to sound less like superhero abilities and more like accidental agricultural sabotage. As we saw earlier, Roman writers claimed menstruating women could spoil wine, damage crops, dull metal tools, and interfere with various natural processes. Similar beliefs appeared elsewhere throughout history. Some people believed menstrual blood could protect against evil spirits. Others believed it attracted them. Humanity has always shown an impressive commitment to covering every possible theory. In certain traditions, menstruation was associated with the moon. This connection was understandable. Both menstrual cycles and lunar cycles followed roughly monthly patterns, making the relationship appear obvious. The moon became linked to fertility, womanhood, and reproduction in many ancient cultures. While the scientific connection was weaker than people imagined, the symbolism proved powerful enough to survive for thousands of years. Another common myth involved emotional behavior. Many ancient writers claimed menstruation dramatically altered a woman's temperament or judgment. While hormonal changes can certainly affect mood, some ancient descriptions make it sound as though women temporarily transformed into entirely different people. Ancient male authors occasionally approached the subject with the same confidence they brought to military strategy and politics. The difference was that many of them actually had experience with military strategy and politics. Perhaps the most enduring myths were those that portrayed menstruation as mysterious or dangerous. These beliefs often reflected broader anxieties about fertility, reproduction, and the female body. People feared what they did not fully understand, and menstruation remained poorly understood for most of human history. Yet there is something revealing about all these myths. They tell us far less about menstruation than they do about the societies that created them. The female body was doing exactly what it had always done. The confusion existed largely in the minds of observers trying to explain it. And while myths spread through stories and traditions, practical knowledge continued spreading another way, through women themselves, sharing experience from one generation to the next. That knowledge, unlike many myths, was usually grounded in reality. After spending centuries listening to ancient philosophers, physicians, priests, and lawmakers explain menstruation, it is worth asking a simple question. What did women themselves think? Unfortunately, this is where history becomes frustrating. Most surviving records from the ancient world were written by men. We possess medical texts written by doctors, legal codes written by officials, and philosophical discussions written by scholars. What we rarely possess are detailed journals from ordinary women describing their monthly experiences. History often preserved the voices of people who enjoyed writing about women far more than listening to them. Yet despite this challenge, glimpses of female knowledge still emerge. Across the ancient world, women learned about menstruation from other women. Mothers taught daughters, older sisters advised younger sisters. Midwives shared practical experience gained through decades of helping women navigate puberty, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause. This informal network of knowledge existed alongside official medicine, and in many cases it was probably far more useful. An ancient physician might spend pages discussing bodily humours and internal balances. A mother teaching her daughter, meanwhile, could explain which cloth was most comfortable, which herbs helped ease cramps, and how to manage a period while carrying out daily work. One approach was theoretical, the other actually helped. Midwives were particularly important. In many societies, midwives possessed an extraordinary amount of practical knowledge about women's health. They observed hundreds of pregnancies, births, and menstrual cycles throughout their careers. While they lacked modern scientific understanding, they gained something equally valuable: experience. Experience tends to notice things that theories miss. A philosopher might spend years debating the nature of fertility. A midwife might quietly recognize patterns after helping generations of families. This practical wisdom often passed orally from one generation to the next. Because it was rarely written down, much of it has been lost. Historians can only reconstruct fragments, yet the fragments suggest women developed sophisticated methods for managing their own health despite the limitations of their time. They understood which materials worked best. They knew which remedies brought comfort. They recognized common symptoms. They shared advice with one another. Most importantly, they adapted. This adaptability appears again and again throughout history. Regardless of the culture, period, or social class, women found ways to navigate the realities of menstruation. They continued working, raising families, maintaining households, and participating in their communities. The ancient world often misunderstood menstruation. Ancient women generally understood it far better, not because they possessed modern science, but because they lived with it every month. And that distinction mattered. As our journey nears its end, we can finally step back and ask a larger question. What does the story of menstruation reveal about the ancient world itself? The answer is surprisingly revealing, not just about women, but about humanity as a whole. As we reach the final stages of our journey, it becomes clear that this story has never been only about periods. It is also a story about knowledge, about who gets to record history, about whose experiences are considered important enough to preserve. And perhaps most of all, it is a story about how human beings try to understand the world around them. For thousands of years, menstruation was a universal part of life. Every kingdom, every empire, every village, and every city contained women managing the same monthly reality. Yet when we open many ancient histories, the subject is almost invisible. Instead, we read about wars. Lots of wars. Apparently, ancient historians could provide detailed descriptions of a battle involving 20,000 soldiers, but somehow neglected to mention how half the population handled a recurring biological process. Priorities were different. Or perhaps simply very male. The silence itself tells us something important. Ancient societies often focused their records on rulers, military campaigns, political events, and religious institutions. Daily life was rarely considered worthy of detailed documentation. The ordinary routines that occupied most people's lives were often left unrecorded. This creates a strange imbalance. We sometimes know the exact date a king signed a treaty, yet remain uncertain about what materials ordinary women used every month. History can be surprisingly selective. Yet despite these gaps, the evidence that survives reveals remarkable resilience. Ancient women manage menstruation without modern medicine, disposable products, running water, pain relievers, or scientific explanations. They adapted using the resources available to them. They developed practical solutions. They shared knowledge across generations. In many ways, they solved problems long before anyone fully understood them. That pattern appears throughout human history. People often learn how to cope with challenges before they understand the science behind those challenges. Farmers grew crops long before genetics existed. Sailors crossed oceans long before modern navigation. Women managed menstruation long before hormones were discovered. Practical experience frequently arrives before scientific explanation. The story also reminds us that intelligence and misunderstanding often coexist. Ancient civilizations achieved extraordinary things. They built monuments that still stand today. They created systems of law, mathematics, engineering, and philosophy that shaped the modern world. Yet those same societies sometimes believed that menstrual blood could spoil wine, frighten bees, damage crops, or influence the weather. Human beings have always been complicated. We are capable of building aqueducts and believing nonsense at the same time. In fact, that may be one of the most consistent themes in history. And as we conclude our exploration, one final chapter remains. After thousands of years of myths, theories, practical solutions, and daily realities, what can we learn from the long journey toward understanding menstruation, and how much has truly changed since the ancient world? And so, after travelling through ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, religious traditions, medical theories, and countless generations of everyday women, we arrive at the end of our story. Or perhaps more accurately, we arrive at the present chapter of a story that is still being written. One of the most remarkable lessons from history is how ordinary experiences can reveal extraordinary things about humanity. Menstruation is a perfect example. For thousands of years, women managed their periods with whatever resources were available. They adapted to their circumstances, shared practical knowledge, and found solutions long before science could explain exactly why those solutions worked. Meanwhile, philosophers debated, doctors theorized, priests interpreted, and occasionally someone became convinced that a woman's period was responsible for the neighbour's failed grape harvest. History is full of surprises. Looking back, it is easy to laugh at some ancient beliefs. The wandering womb, the crop-killing menstrual powers, the mysterious forces supposedly capable of spoiling wine from across a room. Yet before we become too smug, it is worth remembering that future generations may one day examine some of our own beliefs with similar amusement. Human beings have always been experts at being absolutely certain, right before discovering they were mistaken. The difference today is that we possess scientific tools ancient societies could never have imagined. Modern medicine understands menstruation in ways that would have astonished Greek physicians and Roman scholars. Hormones, reproductive biology, genetics, and advanced healthcare have transformed our understanding of the female body. Questions that puzzled entire civilizations can now be answered in a single biology textbook. Although, admittedly, some students still avoid reading those chapters. Certain things never change. What has perhaps changed most dramatically is the willingness to discuss the subject openly. For much of history, menstruation existed in a strange position. It was universal, yet rarely discussed. Common, yet often hidden. Essential to human reproduction, yet frequently surrounded by embarrassment or misunderstanding. Today, while misconceptions still exist, there is far greater recognition that menstruation is simply a normal part of human life. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Behind every ancient kingdom, every empire, every famous monument, and every great historical event were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They worried about their families, their health, their work, and their future. Women experienced periods while pyramids were built. They experienced periods while philosophers taught in Athens. They experienced periods while Roman legions marched across Europe. History continued because life continued. And life continued because countless women quietly managed realities that historians often ignored. So the next time you hear someone describe history as the story of kings and battles, remember that another history existed alongside it. A quieter history. A human history. And one that deserves to be remembered just as much. Now, as we leave the ancient world behind and return to the present, you can rest a little easier, knowing that while humanity has changed in many ways over the centuries, our ability to misunderstand perfectly ordinary things remains reassuringly timeless. Few figures from the Viking Age have inspired more fascination than the Berserker. Long before modern historians began debating hallucinogenic mushrooms, strange herbs, or altered states of consciousness, people across Scandinavia were already telling stories about warriors who seemed to become something other than human when battle began. The accounts are difficult to ignore. According to medieval sagas, berserkers did not fight like ordinary men. Before combat, they reportedly entered a terrifying state of excitement. Their bodies trembled, their faces flushed red, their breathing grew heavy and uneven. Some growled like animals, others howled loudly enough to unsettle entire warbands. One description even claims they bit the rims of their shields while waiting for the fight to begin, as though they could no longer contain the energy building inside them. Then, without warning, they charged. Most warriors valued caution. Viking combat was dangerous, brutal, and unforgiving. A single spear thrust could end a life. Even experienced fighters understood the importance of discipline, positioning, and self-preservation. Yet berserkers seemed to throw those instincts aside. They rushed directly into danger, attacking with a level of aggression that shocked both enemies and allies alike. To observers, it looked almost supernatural. The sagas describe men who felt little fear, ignored wounds, and fought with extraordinary strength. Some stories claim they could not be stopped by steel. Others suggest they remained standing after injuries that would have incapacitated any normal warrior. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated, they left a lasting impression. For centuries, the Berserker became one of the most feared figures in Norse legend. But there is a problem. The people who recorded many of these stories often lived generations after the events themselves. By the time the sagas were written down, storytellers had been retelling these tales around hearthfires for hundreds of years. And storytellers, whether in the Viking Age or today, tend to improve a story with every retelling. A brave warrior becomes an unstoppable warrior. An angry fighter becomes a raging beast. A frightening battle becomes a legendary one. Yet even after accounting for exaggeration, historians have noticed something intriguing. Many descriptions of berserkers share the same unusual details. The trembling, the shouting, the animal-like behaviour, the apparent indifference to pain. These similarities suggest that the stories may have been inspired by a real phenomenon rather than pure imagination. So what exactly happened to these warriors before battle? Were they entering a religious trance? Were they trained to push their minds beyond ordinary limits? Or were they using strange substances that altered their thoughts, emotions, and perception of reality? The search for answers has produced some of the most unusual theories in Viking history, and some involve plants and mushrooms that are every bit as mysterious as the berserkers themselves. Before we start filling Viking helmets with mushrooms and mysterious herbs, it helps to ask a simple question. What do the original sources actually say? The answer is both fascinating and frustrating. Most of what we know about berserkers comes from old Norse sagas and historical writings composed centuries after the Viking Age itself. These texts describe warriors who entered an unusual mental state before battle, but they rarely explain how that state was achieved. For historians, this is rather inconvenient. It is like receiving a recipe that says, "make a cake," but omits every ingredient. One of the most famous descriptions appears in writings associated with the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson. He described warriors of Odin who fought without armour and behaved like wild animals. According to his account, they were as fierce as wolves or bears, killed enemies with incredible force, and seemed unaffected by fire or iron while their rage lasted. The comparison to bears is particularly important. The word berserker may have meant bear shirt or bear coat, suggesting some connection to bear symbolism. Other warriors, known as Ulfhednar, were associated with wolves. These animal connections appear repeatedly throughout Norse literature. Warriors were not merely fighting like bears or wolves. In some sense, they may have believed they were taking on the qualities of those animals. That idea immediately raises intriguing possibilities. Were berserkers participating in rituals designed to transform their identity? Did they enter battle believing that Odin had granted them the strength and courage of a powerful beast? If so, psychology may have played a larger role than any physical substance. What the sagas consistently emphasize is behavior. The warriors roar, they shake, they become aggressive, they appear fearless. Then, after the battle, many accounts describe exhaustion. Some stories mention weakness lasting for days after the fury subsided, as though the warriors had completely drained themselves. Interestingly, the texts rarely mention drinking special potions or eating strange plants before combat. Modern readers often assume such details must exist somewhere in the sources. They do not. This absence has created one of the great debates surrounding berserkers. If drugs or hallucinogens were involved, why do the sagas never clearly mention them? On the other hand, if no substances were involved, how do we explain the extraordinary behaviour described so consistently across different accounts? Those questions have led generations of historians to search beyond the sagas themselves. And eventually, many of them arrived at a bright red mushroom growing quietly on the forest floor. If there is one theory that has captured the public imagination more than any other, It is the idea that berserkers went into battle under the influence of hallucinogenic mushrooms, specifically a mushroom called fly agaric. Even if you have never heard its name before, you have probably seen it. Fly agaric is the bright red mushroom covered with white spots that appears in fairy tales, fantasy art, and video games. It looks almost too magical to be real, which may explain why so many people immediately found the theory appealing. The connection between fly agaric and berserkers became popular during the 18th and 19th centuries. Scholars began searching for natural explanations behind the legendary battle rage described in the Norse sagas. When they learned about the mushroom's mind-altering properties, some believed they had finally solved the mystery. At first glance, the idea seemed convincing. Fly agaric contains psychoactive compounds that can affect perception, mood, and behavior. People who consume it may experience feelings of increased energy, distorted senses, unusual confidence, and changes in awareness. Some users have reported sensations of strength or invulnerability. Others described feeling detached from pain or fear. To a historian reading descriptions of berserkers, those reports sounded remarkably familiar. Imagine a warrior preparing for battle. He consumes the mushroom. His perception begins to shift. Fear fades into the background. His judgment changes. The sounds of the battlefield become distorted. His confidence grows beyond normal limits. Soon he is charging toward enemy lines with a recklessness that ordinary fighters find terrifying. It is easy to see why the theory gained popularity. The idea also seemed to fit broader patterns found across northern Eurasia. Various indigenous groups in Siberia were known to use fly agaric in spiritual rituals, ceremonies, and altered states of consciousness. Since Norse traders travelled widely across northern regions, some scholars suggested that knowledge of the mushroom might have spread through cultural contacts. The more researchers looked, the more attractive the theory appeared. A mysterious warrior cult. A mind-altering mushroom. Legends describing superhuman rage. It sounded almost perfect. In fact, it sounded a little too perfect. Because as historians examined the evidence more closely, cracks began to appear. The problem was not whether fly agaric could alter the mind. It certainly could. The problem was whether its effects actually matched what a berserker would need on a battlefield. And once researchers started comparing the mushroom's real effects with the realities of combat, the famous theory began to look far less certain than it first appeared. The fly agaric theory has one major advantage. It is exciting. A mysterious Viking warrior consumes a magical-looking mushroom, enters an altered state of consciousness, and charges fearlessly into battle. It sounds like the perfect explanation for berserker rage. The problem is that history is not obligated to provide perfect explanations. When researchers began examining the actual effects of fly agaric, they discovered several problems. The first issue is unpredictability. Unlike a carefully measured modern medication, wild mushrooms do not provide consistent results. Two mushrooms growing only a few feet apart can contain different concentrations of psychoactive compounds. One person might experience mild stimulation. Another might become confused, nauseated, or completely disoriented. That is not exactly what military commanders look for in elite shock troops. Imagine preparing for a battle where half your warriors become energetic and fearless, while the other half spend the morning vomiting behind a tree. It is difficult to build an effective combat strategy around that level of uncertainty. The side effects present an even bigger challenge. Historical and modern reports of fly agaric consumption frequently mention dizziness, muscle twitching, blurred vision, confusion, and impaired coordination. Some users experience periods of deep sleep. Others report difficulty distinguishing reality from hallucination. Again, these effects do not fit particularly well with the demands of combat. A berserker might have fought aggressively, but he still needed to recognize friend from foe. He needed to dodge attacks, maintain balance, and react quickly to constantly changing situations. A warrior stumbling around the battlefield while seeing imaginary animals is far more likely to become a casualty than a legend. Another problem is the lack of direct evidence. Despite decades of discussion, no Norse source explicitly states that berserkers consumed fly agaric before battle. Archaeologists have also failed to uncover clear evidence linking the mushroom to berserker rituals. The theory relies largely on circumstantial connections rather than direct proof. This does not mean the idea is impossible. Some historians still believe the mushroom could have played a role in certain rituals or ceremonies. Others suggest that occasional use may have occurred without being recorded. But most scholars today are far more cautious than their predecessors were a century ago. The famous mushroom theory has not disappeared. It simply lost its status as the leading explanation. As researchers searched for alternatives, attention gradually shifted toward another plant, one whose effects seemed to match the descriptions of berserker behavior far more closely. Unlike fly agaric, this plant was known for producing aggression, confusion, and violent excitement. Its name was henbane, and its reputation was far darker than any mushroom growing in the northern forests. As confidence in the mushroom theory began to fade, historians started looking elsewhere. If fly agaric did not fully explain berserker behavior, perhaps another substance did. That search led researchers to a plant with a far more sinister reputation, henbane. Unlike the bright red fly agaric mushroom, henbane is not the sort of plant that appears in children's storybooks. For thousands of years, it was known across Europe and parts of Asia as a dangerous and unpredictable herb. Ancient physicians used it cautiously. Folk healers feared it, and in large doses, it could produce terrifying effects. Some historians believe it may offer a better explanation for berserker rage than any mushroom ever could. Henbane belongs to a family of plants that contains powerful psychoactive chemicals. These compounds affect the nervous system and can produce a wide range of symptoms. Users may experience confusion, hallucinations, agitation, paranoia, loss of inhibition, and intense emotional reactions. In some cases, people become unusually aggressive. That detail immediately caught the attention of researchers. Unlike fly agaric, which often causes drowsiness or coordination problems, henbane's effects can include restlessness, excitement, and unpredictable bursts of energy. Historical records from various periods describe individuals becoming violent, irrational, or completely detached from normal behavior after consuming the plant. Those descriptions sound surprisingly familiar. A warrior entering a state of extreme aggression, a reduced sense of fear, unusual resistance to pain, wild and erratic behavior. The similarities are difficult to ignore. The theory gained additional support when archaeologists made an interesting discovery. Henbane seeds have been found at several Scandinavian archaeological sites dating to the Viking Age. In some cases, the seeds appear to have been intentionally stored rather than simply growing wild nearby. This does not prove that berserkers used the plant, but it does prove that Norse people knew about it. That alone makes henbane a more plausible candidate than some of the more speculative theories that have been proposed over the years. Even so, significant problems remain. Henbane is notoriously dangerous. The difference between a mind-altering dose and a potentially fatal one can be alarmingly small. Symptoms often include confusion, memory loss, blurred vision, and severe disorientation. A warrior under its influence might become aggressive. but he might also become completely incapable of following orders or recognizing what was happening around him. Once again, historians found themselves facing the same challenge. A substance might explain part of the Berserker phenomenon without explaining all of it, and that realization led many scholars toward a surprising conclusion. Perhaps they had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. Maybe Berserker rage was never caused by a single plant, mushroom, or potion at all. By the time historians had spent decades debating mushrooms and henbane, an uncomfortable reality began to emerge. Neither explanation fully worked. Fly agaric could alter perception, but its effects seemed poorly suited for combat. Henbane could cause aggression, but it often produced confusion severe enough to make effective fighting nearly impossible. Both theories explained certain aspects of Berserker behaviour, while leaving many others unanswered. As a result, a growing number of scholars began considering a different possibility. What if Berserker rage was not primarily caused by a substance at all? What if the secret lay in the mind? Modern psychology offers some intriguing parallels. Throughout history, humans have demonstrated an extraordinary ability to enter altered mental states without consuming any drugs. Religious ecstasy, trance rituals, extreme meditation, and even certain military training techniques can dramatically change how a person experiences fear, pain, and stress. The Viking world was filled with practices that may have encouraged exactly this kind of transformation. Many berserkers were closely associated with Odin, the chief god of the Norse pantheon. Odin was not merely a god of wisdom, he was also a god of battle, frenzy, magic, and altered consciousness. His followers often sought experiences that pushed them beyond ordinary human limits. For a warrior devoted to Odin, battle may have been more than a military activity. It may have been a sacred experience. Imagine spending years preparing yourself psychologically for combat. You participate in rituals. You hear stories of legendary warriors. You wear animal skins associated with bears or wolves. You chant alongside your companions. Your breathing quickens. Your heart races. The sounds of drums and shouting fill the air. Gradually, your normal identity begins to fade. You are no longer a farmer, hunter, or craftsman. You become the bear. You become the wolf. You become the warrior chosen by Odin. To modern readers, this may sound strange. Yet similar phenomena have been documented in cultures around the world. Soldiers, athletes, martial artists, and religious practitioners sometimes report entering states of intense focus where fear diminishes, pain becomes less noticeable, and ordinary awareness seems to narrow. No mushrooms required. This does not necessarily mean substances played no role. Some historians suspect that herbs, alcohol, rituals, and psychological conditioning may have worked together rather than separately. A small amount of a psychoactive plant might have enhanced a state already being created through belief and training. If that is true, then the Berserker was not simply a drug user. He was part of a carefully constructed system designed to transform an ordinary man into something far more terrifying on the battlefield. And that transformation may have begun long before the first sword was ever drawn. If Berserker rage was not entirely caused by mushrooms or herbs, another possibility remains. What if the most powerful substance involved was one produced by the human body itself? Today, scientists understand that extreme stress can trigger remarkable physical changes. When humans face danger, the body releases a flood of chemicals designed to improve the chances of survival. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes faster. Blood is redirected toward muscles. Pain sensitivity decreases. Reaction times can improve dramatically. This is commonly known as the fight or flight response. For most people, the effect is temporary. A sudden threat appears, the body reacts, and normal functioning eventually returns. But in rare circumstances, individuals can enter far more intense states. Stories from modern battlefields occasionally describe soldiers continuing to fight despite serious injuries. Athletes have completed competitions without realizing they had broken bones. People trapped in emergencies have displayed extraordinary strength while rescuing loved ones. These events sound unusual, but they are very real. In such moments, the brain prioritizes survival over comfort. Pain signals become less important. Fear is pushed into the background. The body essentially says, "We can deal with the injuries later. Right now, staying alive is the only thing that matters." Some historians believe berserkers may have learned how to trigger this state deliberately. Instead of waiting for danger to activate the response naturally, they may have used rituals, chanting, breathing exercises, and psychological conditioning to push themselves into an extreme version of it before battle even began. This would explain several features found in the sagas. The trembling could result from a surge of adrenaline. The intense aggression could emerge from heightened arousal and emotional excitement. The reduced sensitivity to pain could be a natural consequence of the body's emergency responses. Even the exhaustion described after battle fits the pattern. Once the chemicals wear off, the body often crashes. Fatigue, weakness, and emotional exhaustion can follow intense periods of stress. Modern soldiers sometimes report similar experiences after combat. Interestingly, this theory does not require us to choose between psychology and substances. Both could have contributed. A warrior might have consumed alcohol or mild psychoactive herbs during rituals. He might have chanted with fellow warriors, invoked Odin, worn animal skins, and prepared mentally for violence. Together, these factors could create a powerful combination that amplified the body's natural chemistry. The result would not be a magical transformation. It would be something far more believable. A human being pushed to the absolute limits of what the mind and body can achieve. And if that is true, the real mystery is not what berserkers consumed. It is how they learned to unlock abilities that most people never experience at all. For all the theories surrounding berserkers, there is one problem that continues to frustrate historians. Archaeology is stubbornly silent. If berserkers routinely consumed special mushrooms, herbs, or potions before battle, we would love to find physical evidence of it. Unfortunately, Viking Age graves rarely provide such clear answers. Unlike a sword or a brooch, a plant does not survive very well after 1,000 years buried in the ground. As a result, researchers often find themselves working with fragments rather than certainty. A few discoveries have generated excitement. Henbane seeds, for example, have been uncovered at several Scandinavian sites dating to the Viking Age. Some were found in contexts suggesting deliberate use rather than accidental growth. Archaeologists have also discovered evidence of medicinal and ritual plants throughout Norse settlements. This tells us something important. The Vikings possessed considerable knowledge of herbs and natural substances. They understood which plants could heal, which could poison, and which could alter the mind. They were not wandering through forests randomly eating mushrooms and hoping for the best. Like most pre-modern societies, they accumulated generations of practical knowledge about the natural world. Yet knowing about a plant is not the same as using it to create berserkers. That leap remains difficult to prove. The same challenge appears when examining warrior graves. Historians have uncovered richly furnished burials containing weapons, armour, and symbols associated with status and warfare. However, there is no universally recognised berserker grave. that definitively identifies its occupant as one of these legendary warriors. In many ways, this is unsurprising. The term Berserker may not have referred to a permanent social class at all. It could have described a role, a temporary state, or a specific group of elite warriors whose identity left few archaeological traces behind. Some scholars even argue that the search for physical evidence may be leading us astray. Perhaps Berserker rage was primarily cultural rather than chemical. A belief system does not leave behind bones, seeds, or artifacts in the same way a weapon does. Rituals vanish. Chants disappear. Psychological conditioning leaves no fossil record. This means archaeology can show us pieces of the puzzle, but rarely the entire picture. It can confirm that certain plants existed. It can prove that Vikings used herbs. It can reveal how warriors lived and died. But it cannot tell us exactly what happened inside a berserker's mind as he prepared for battle. And that lingering uncertainty may explain why, after centuries of research, the mystery of berserker rage remains as fascinating as ever. After centuries of debate, dozens of theories, and countless pages of academic arguments, we arrive at a surprising conclusion. Nobody knows for certain what caused berserker rage. That may sound disappointing, but in many ways it is what makes the subject so fascinating. If archaeologists discovered a Viking instruction manual tomorrow that read, "Step 1. Eat this mushroom before battle," the mystery would be solved. Historians would celebrate briefly, write a few papers, and move on to the next puzzle. Instead, the evidence remains incomplete, forcing each generation to revisit the question from a new angle. Some scholars continue to favour the fly agaric theory. They point to the mushroom's mind-altering effects and its long history of ritual use in northern cultures. Others argue that henbane remains the strongest candidate because its symptoms more closely resemble aggression and frenzy. Still others reject both explanations. The sun is sinking behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the wooden towers and stone walls of the Roman fort. For most of the day, the garrison has been a place of noise and movement. Orders have been shouted. Horses have come and gone through the gates. Soldiers have stood watch on the ramparts, drilled in the training yard, repaired roads, hauled supplies, and completed the endless list of duties that kept Rome's vast empire functioning. But now, something changes. Across the fort, a trumpet sounds. Its notes drift through the evening air, echoing between barracks and workshops. Every soldier immediately recognizes the signal. The working day is ending. That does not mean discipline disappears. This is still the Roman army, one of the most organized military forces in history. But for a few precious hours, the pace begins to slow. Along the walls, sentries prepare for the night watch. Fresh guards replace those who have spent hours staring across forests, deserts, mountains, or whatever frontier Rome currently happens to be occupying. Some soldiers descend from watchtowers with tired legs and stiff backs. Others climb the wooden stairs carrying spears and shields, preparing for a long night of vigilance. At the main gate, officers conduct final inspections. Wagons arriving late are checked before entering. Merchants hurry through before the gates are secured. Once darkness fully arrives, movement becomes more restricted. The Roman army takes security seriously, particularly on distant frontiers where hostile tribes may be watching from beyond the horizon. Inside the fort, soldiers begin returning to their quarters. The transformation is surprisingly human. Helmets are loosened. Heavy shields are set aside. A soldier who spent the day carrying construction materials stretches his aching shoulders. Another removes his boots and discovers once again that marching several miles while carrying half your body weight in equipment is not particularly relaxing. The smell of cooking fires gradually spreads through the fort. For many soldiers, this is the most anticipated moment of the day. Not battle, not glory. Supper. After all, even Rome's finest legionaries could spend hours dreaming about a warm meal. As twilight deepens, conversations begin to replace commands. The harsh rhythms of military life soften slightly. The fort remains alert, guarded and disciplined, but another side of Roman military life is emerging. The side rarely shown in heroic stories. The evening world of ordinary soldiers who, after a long day of service, simply wanted a place to sit, eat, and forget about tomorrow's duties for a little while. As the last traces of daylight fade beyond the fort's walls, soldiers stream back toward the barracks blocks that line the interior streets. The evening trumpet may have ended the day's major duties, but nobody simply collapses onto a bed and calls it a night. First comes the ritual of putting the army away. A Roman soldier's equipment is expensive, valuable, and absolutely essential for survival. Armour is inspected for loose straps. Helmets are checked for damage. Shields are leaned carefully against walls. Spears are stacked in orderly rows. A neglected piece of equipment could become tomorrow's disaster, and Roman officers were not known for their patience with careless soldiers. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere is very different from the formal discipline outside. Each building houses a group of soldiers who live together for years, sometimes decades. They march together, train together, and occasionally fight together. Over time, these men become something closer to a family, albeit a family that settles disagreements with considerably more shouting than most. The rooms themselves are surprisingly modest. Hollywood often imagines Roman soldiers living in grand stone halls filled with banners and shining armour. The reality was far less glamorous. Most soldiers shared cramped rooms with several comrades. Personal space was limited. Privacy was nearly non-existent. If someone snored loudly, everyone learned about it. And someone always snored loudly. Wooden chests contain personal belongings. Spare clothing hangs from pegs driven into walls. A few treasured possessions might decorate a corner. A lucky charm from home, a small religious figure, a letter from family, or perhaps a coin saved from a distant campaign. These small objects matter more than their value suggests. Many soldiers serve hundreds of miles from their birthplace. A recruit from Italy might find himself stationed in Britain. A Spaniard could end up guarding a fort along the Danube. The empire is enormous, and military service often carries men very far from everything familiar. As equipment is stored away, the mood gradually relaxes. Conversations fill the room. Some soldiers complain about officers. Others complain about weather. This is one of the great constants of military history. Whether in ancient Rome or the modern world, soldiers have always possessed a remarkable ability to discuss how much better things would be if someone else were in charge. Laughter begins to spread through the barracks. The day is finally ending. And as hunger starts to overpower every other concern, attention shifts toward the most important event of the evening: supper. By the time the soldiers leave their barracks and head toward the evening meal, darkness has begun to settle over the fort. Lanterns flicker along the main streets. Cooking fires glow behind wooden walls. The smell of smoke, bread and stewing vegetables drifts through the cool night air. For many soldiers, this is the best part of the day, not because the food is extraordinary. Usually, it is not. But after hours of marching, drilling, construction work, patrol duty, or standing guard beneath the sun and rain, almost any hot meal feels like a reward from the gods. Roman soldiers are expected to prepare much of their own food. The army provides supplies, but soldiers often work together in small groups known as contubernia. These 8-man units share living space, responsibilities, and meals. If one man burns the supper, 7 others suffer the consequences. This arrangement encourages teamwork. It also encourages strong opinions about cooking. One soldier insists the stew needs more herbs. Another claims it needs less. A third contributes nothing except criticism, a role that seems to exist in every civilization throughout history. Tonight's meal is simple but filling. Bread forms the foundation of almost every supper. Alongside it may be porridge made from wheat or barley. Cheese is common. Beans, lentils, onions, and cabbage frequently appear. Salted pork or bacon sometimes adds flavour. On fortunate evenings, there may be fresh meat from hunting, local purchases, or military supplies. The Roman army understood an important truth. Hungry soldiers are unhappy soldiers, and unhappy soldiers have a remarkable talent for creating problems. Wine accompanies many meals, though often diluted with water. Drinking pure wine is generally viewed as excessive by Roman standards. The mixture provides refreshment while making stored water safer to consume. As soldiers eat, conversation becomes louder. The formal structure of military life relaxes. Men exchange jokes, discuss rumours, and speculate about future assignments. Some boast about old campaigns. Others exaggerate encounters with enemies that become slightly more heroic every time they are retold. A soldier who once chased away a thief eventually becomes a man who single-handedly defended an entire supply convoy. Memory can be surprisingly generous. Yet beneath the laughter lies something more important. These meals create bonds. The men sitting around the fire may someday depend on one another in battle. Trust is not built only through training grounds and marches. It is also built through thousands of ordinary evenings spent sharing food, stories, and complaints. And as the bowls empty and the fires burn lower, the fort begins to enter its most relaxed hours of the night. As supper comes to an end, nobody is particularly eager to go straight to sleep. The barracks are warm, the fires are still burning, and for a few precious hours there are no roads to build, no ditches to dig, and no officers demanding that someone carry something heavy from one side of the fort to the other, for reasons that remain mysterious even 2,000 years later. So the soldiers sit. Some gather around small hearths. Others remain at the tables where they have just eaten. A few lean against walls with cups of diluted wine in hand. The atmosphere grows quieter than it was during supper, but far more personal. This is when the stories begin. Every Roman fort contains veterans. These men are easy to identify. They move with confidence. They know every shortcut through the camp. They understand which officers are strict, which are fair, and which should be avoided whenever possible. Most importantly, they possess an endless supply of stories. Whether all of those stories are true is another matter entirely. A young recruit might listen wide-eyed as a veteran describes a campaign deep in Germania. According to the veteran, the forests were endless, the weather was terrible, and the local tribes seemed capable of appearing out of thin air. Conveniently, the veteran himself always behaved with exceptional bravery. The same pattern repeats across the empire. A soldier from Syria tells stories about desert caravans. A cavalryman remembers hunting bandits in distant mountains. An archer describes a battle that somehow becomes larger and more dangerous every year he retells it. Nobody seems particularly concerned about accuracy. After all, a good story is worth far more than a perfectly factual one. The conversations are not always about war. Many soldiers discuss their homes. They speak of farms, villages, wives, parents, and childhood memories. Men stationed on distant frontiers often find themselves thinking about places they have not seen in years. For some, military service is an adventure. For others, it is a very long separation from everything familiar. The stories help. They make distant places feel closer. They remind soldiers that life exists beyond the walls of the fort. As the evening continues, laughter occasionally erupts from one corner of the room. Someone tells a joke. Someone else imitates an unpopular officer. This is usually done when the officer is nowhere nearby, a survival strategy that has remained popular throughout military history. Gradually, the conversations grow more thoughtful. The excitement of supper has faded. The fire burns lower, and as memories of home begin to surface, many soldiers find themselves reaching for something they treasure more than wine, food, or even stories. A letter from home. As the stories begin to fade and the evening settles into a quieter rhythm, some soldiers reach for their most treasured possessions. Not their swords, not their helmets, not even the pay they have carefully saved inside wooden chests. They reach for letters. A Roman fort might seem like a world of weapons, discipline, and military routine, but beneath the armour are ordinary men who miss home. And home can feel very far away. The Roman Empire stretches across 3 continents. A recruit born in northern Italy may find himself stationed along the Rhine frontier. A soldier from Gaul could spend years guarding a fort in Britain. Some men serve so far from their birthplace that they will never see their hometown again. Letters become their connection to another life. The Roman postal system is remarkably efficient for its time, especially when military matters are involved. Personal correspondence travels more slowly, but messages still find their way across mountains, forests, and seas. Eventually, news arrives. A brother has married. A child has been born. A harvest was successful. A parent has fallen ill. The letter might contain nothing more than ordinary details, yet those details are priceless. Inside the barracks, soldiers sit near lantern light, carefully unfolding pieces of papyrus or wooden writing tablets. Some read silently, others read aloud to friends. Not every soldier is fully literate, and it is common for comrades to help one another understand complicated messages. The Roman world leaves behind fascinating examples of these letters. At forts near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, archaeologists have discovered writing tablets that reveal surprisingly human concerns. Soldiers request supplies. Officers exchange invitations. Families discuss daily problems. One famous letter even contains an invitation to a birthday party. History books often focus on emperors and battles. The letters remind us that real people lived through those events. As one soldier smiles while reading news from home, another stares quietly into the fire. Not every letter brings good news. Months can pass between messages. By the time a soldier learns of a death, a marriage, or a family crisis, the event may already belong to the distant past. That uncertainty becomes one of the hardest parts of military life. Yet, the letters provide comfort nonetheless. For a few moments, a man stationed on a cold frontier can imagine himself back in the streets of his hometown, walking familiar roads among familiar faces. Outside, the night grows darker. Inside, the lanterns continue to glow. And while some soldiers read letters, others begin looking for a different way to pass the evening, one involving dice, wagers, and the possibility of losing tomorrow's pay before breakfast even arrives. As the letters are folded away and tucked safely back into wooden chests, the atmosphere inside the fort begins to change once again. The reflective mood does not last long. Roman soldiers, much like soldiers throughout history, possess a remarkable talent for finding ways to entertain themselves whenever they have a few free hours. And sometimes those ways involve making questionable financial decisions. Before long, dice begin appearing. Small bone or ivory cubes emerge from pockets and bags. Men gather around tables, benches, and even sections of the floor. Coins change hands. Wagers are proposed. Arguments about rules immediately follow. Some things never change. Gambling is enormously popular throughout the Roman world. Officially, certain forms of betting are restricted. Unofficially, soldiers continue gambling with a level of enthusiasm that would surprise absolutely nobody. A few coins might be at stake, or perhaps a share of tomorrow's wine, or a promise to perform an unpleasant chore. The exact prize matters less than the competition itself. Around the room, cheers and groans erupt as fortunes rise and fall within seconds. One soldier enjoys a brief period of success and begins behaving as though he possesses divine favour from Jupiter himself. 20 minutes later, he has lost everything and is suddenly convinced the dice are cursed. Nearby, another group entertains itself differently. Board games are common in Roman forts. Archaeologists have discovered gaming pieces and boards at military sites across the empire. Some games require strategy, others rely heavily on luck. All provide a welcome escape from the routines of military life. The fort can also be surprisingly musical. Not every soldier is a talented musician, but that rarely stops them from trying. A man produces a flute, another sings a popular song from his homeland. The quality of the performance varies considerably. Some musicians earn applause. Others inspire polite requests to perhaps stop performing immediately. Still, the entertainment serves its purpose. Laughter spreads through the barracks. For a few hours, the concerns of military service fade into the background. No one is thinking about enemy raids. No one is worrying about tomorrow's inspections. No one is carrying heavy equipment across muddy roads. Instead, they are simply enjoying the company of friends. Yet while most of the fort relaxes, not everyone has the luxury of joining the games. Outside, beyond the warm lantern light and cheerful conversations, soldiers are already taking their positions on the walls. The night watch is beginning, and someone must remain awake while everyone else sleeps. While dice continue rolling inside the barracks and the last songs drift through the evening air, another part of the fort is settling into a very different routine. The night watch is beginning. For the soldiers assigned to guard duty, the day's work is far from over. Across the fort, fresh sentries collect their equipment and make their way toward the walls, towers, and gates. Some carry spears. Others bring shields and cloaks to protect against the night's cold. Depending on the province, that cold can range from mildly uncomfortable to thoroughly miserable. A soldier stationed in Egypt may spend the night beneath clear desert stars. A soldier in northern Britain may spend it wondering whether the rain is falling sideways on purpose. The Roman army serves everywhere, and every frontier comes with its own challenges. At the main gate, guards carefully inspect the locking mechanisms before taking their posts. Once darkness settles fully, security becomes even more important. A fort is more than a military base. It is a storage centre, an administrative hub, and often the heart of Roman authority in the region. Losing it would be unthinkable. From the watchtowers, sentries stare out into the darkness beyond the walls. During the day, the landscape is familiar. Fields, forests, rivers, hills. At night, everything changes. Shapes become uncertain. Shadows seem to move. A distant animal can sound surprisingly similar to an approaching intruder. Every rustle in the undergrowth suddenly feels worthy of investigation. Most nights, nothing happens. And that may be the hardest part. Standing guard for hours while absolutely nothing occurs requires a level of patience rarely celebrated in heroic stories. Historians love writing about dramatic battles. They spend far less time discussing the soldier who spent 6 hours staring at a dark tree and confirming that it remained a tree. Yet this routine vigilance is one of the reasons Rome maintains its empire for so long. The soldiers stay alert because occasionally something does happen. A traveller arrives late. A messenger appears with urgent news. A suspicious figure is spotted near the walls. The guards must be ready for all possibilities. Meanwhile, inside the fort, most soldiers have already retired to their quarters. The fires burn lower. Conversations fade. The streets become quiet. Only the sounds of footsteps, distant voices, and the occasional challenge from a sentry break the silence. The fort is sleeping, but it is never completely asleep, because somewhere along the wall, beneath the stars, a Roman soldier remains awake, watching the darkness, so thousands of others can rest safely behind the gates. As the night watch settles into its long vigil, the fort grows quieter than at any other time of day, but it never becomes completely silent. A Roman fort may appear asleep from a distance, its walls dark beneath the stars and its gates firmly shut. Yet behind those walls, dozens of small activities continue long after most soldiers have crawled beneath their blankets. The Empire does not pause simply because the sun has gone down. Inside the barracks, some men are still awake. A few soldiers lie on their beds, staring into the darkness. Sleep comes easily after some days. After others, it stubbornly refuses to arrive. Thoughts wander towards home, future assignments, old battles, or tomorrow's duties. The human mind has always possessed an unfortunate tendency to become most active precisely when one is trying to sleep. Nearby, someone snores, loudly. Another soldier throws a sandal in his direction. The snoring continues. Certain military problems prove timeless. Elsewhere in the fort, officers remain busy. Reports must be completed. Supply records need updating. Messages received during the day are organised for dispatch. The Roman army is famous for its discipline, but that discipline depends upon an enormous amount of paperwork. The empire is conquered by soldiers. It is maintained by administrators with wax tablets. In the workshops, blacksmiths occasionally finish urgent repairs. A damaged buckle or broken tool needed for the next morning cannot always wait. The glow of a forge may still be visible through a doorway, accompanied by the occasional ring of metal striking metal. Near the stables, grooms check on horses one final time. Animals are valuable military assets. A cavalry mount represents a significant investment, and nobody wants to explain to a superior officer that an expensive horse became ill because someone forgot a simple task. Even the kitchens are not entirely inactive. Preparations for the next day often begin before the current one has fully ended. Grain is measured. Supplies are inspected. Water is collected. All across the fort, small responsibilities continue quietly in the background. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, the frontier remains unpredictable. A wolf howls in the distance. Wind moves through nearby trees. A river flows steadily through the darkness. The soldiers on watch continue scanning the horizon. Most nights pass peacefully. The gates remain secure. No alarms sound. No enemy appears. And that ordinary, uneventful success is exactly what Rome wants. Because while dramatic victories make history books, empires are usually preserved by countless quiet nights in which nothing goes wrong at all. Soon, however, even the last conversations fade away. The fort is approaching its deepest hours of darkness, and most of its inhabitants are finally surrendering to sleep. Sometime after midnight, the Roman fort reaches its quietest moment. The games have ended. The fires have burned low. The final conversations have faded into silence. Across the barracks, rows of soldiers lie asleep beneath wool blankets. Their shields rest against walls. Their weapons remain within reach. Boots sit beside beds, ready for another day that will begin far sooner than anyone would prefer. For now, however, there is peace. The deep hours before dawn possess a unique feeling inside a Roman fort. This is the brief period when military discipline, construction projects, patrol schedules, and administrative duties seem very far away. The empire itself feels distant. The noise of the day has vanished, leaving only the small sounds of the night. A soldier turns over in his sleep. Someone mutters a few words from a dream. Rain taps softly against a roof. The wind rattles a wooden shutter. These sounds become familiar companions during years of service. Many soldiers spend a significant portion of their adult lives inside forts like this one. Some arrive as young recruits barely old enough to shave. Others leave decades later as veterans whose hair has begun turning grey. Over time, the fort becomes more than a workplace. It becomes home. Not necessarily a home anyone would have chosen, but a home nonetheless. Long before its decline, long before gunpowder thundered across battlefields, and long before kings began questioning its value, jousting stood at the very centre of noble life. For several centuries it was more than a sport. It was more than entertainment. In the eyes of medieval Europe, jousting represented everything a knight was supposed to be. Imagine arriving at a great tournament during the 15th century. The roads leading to the city are crowded with travellers. Merchants sell food, ribbons and souvenirs. Noble families arrive with enormous entourages. Heralds announce famous competitors. Colourful banners flutter from towers and pavilions, transforming an ordinary field into something resembling a temporary kingdom. The excitement is impossible to ignore. Thousands gather around the lists, the fenced lane where the contest will take place. Ladies in elaborate dresses fill special viewing stands. Noblemen discuss their favourite competitors. Children dream of becoming knights themselves. Even common people, who will never wear armour or own a warhorse, push forward for a better view. Then the trumpets sound. The crowd falls silent. Two knights emerge from opposite ends of the field. The amount of wealth represented by these men is staggering. Their armour has been polished until it gleams in the sunlight. Their horses are covered in decorative cloth, bearing family colours and heraldic symbols. Months, sometimes years, of preparation have led to this moment. Each rider lowers his lance. The signal is given. The horses surge forward. For a few seconds, the entire crowd watches as hundreds of pounds of armoured man and horse accelerate toward another equally determined opponent. Then comes the impact. Wood explodes. Wood. Splinters fly through the air. The audience erupts with cheers. A successful strike can bring fame across an entire kingdom. A spectacular victory may attract wealthy patrons, advantageous marriages, or invitations to even greater tournaments. In many ways, jousting functions as the medieval equivalent of professional sports, celebrity culture, and military competition all at once. The best knights become famous throughout Europe. Their names spread from castle to castle. Songs celebrate their victories. Stories exaggerate their accomplishments. Occasionally, reality becomes almost impossible to distinguish from legend. Yet behind the pageantry lies something more important. People often imagine tournaments as elaborate games, but medieval society sees them differently. To kings, nobles, and knights, jousting serves a serious purpose. It rewards courage, skill, discipline, and mastery of mounted combat. In an age when armoured cavalry dominates warfare, the knight appears unstoppable, and as the crowds cheer another shattered lance, few can imagine that this golden age is already approaching its final centuries. The battlefield itself is beginning to change, and the knight does not yet realise it. The cheering crowd sees excitement. The knight sees opportunity. As the dust settles from another successful joust, it becomes clear that tournaments are about far more than broken lances and roaring spectators. Behind the spectacle lies an entire system that shapes noble society across medieval Europe. For a young knight, a tournament can change everything. Unlike the heroes of romantic stories, most knights are not wealthy lords ruling vast estates. Many come from minor noble families with limited land and limited prospects. They possess training, ambition, and expensive equipment, but turning those advantages into status requires visibility. Tournaments provide exactly that. A skilled competitor can earn prize money, valuable equipment, and widespread recognition. Victorious knights sometimes win horses, armour, weapons, or substantial ransoms from defeated opponents. In particularly successful years, a talented tournament fighter can accumulate a small fortune. Not bad for a day spent trying to hit someone with a stick. Of course, the stick is attached to a charging warhorse, and the person being hit is wearing enough steel to outfit a small blacksmith shop. Details matter. Beyond financial rewards, tournaments serve as networking events for the medieval elite. Noble families gather from across entire regions. Alliances are discussed. Marriages are arranged. Political relationships are strengthened. A tournament field often functions as a giant outdoor conference where diplomacy happens alongside controlled violence. Kings understand this perfectly. Many rulers actively sponsor tournaments because they reinforce the values that medieval society admires. Courage, loyalty, discipline, and martial skill are placed on public display. A successful tournament reminds everyone who belongs to the warrior class and why that class occupies such a privileged position. The military benefits are equally important. A knight's primary role is warfare. Maintaining combat skills requires constant practice, and tournaments provide a relatively safe environment to sharpen those abilities. Riders learn horse control, timing, balance, and lance technique. They gain experience operating under pressure, while thousands of spectators watch every mistake. In theory, today's tournament champion may become tomorrow's battlefield hero. For centuries, this assumption seems completely reasonable. After all, the mounted knight dominates European warfare. Heavy cavalry charges have shattered enemy formations for generations. The combination of armour, training, and powerful horses appears nearly unbeatable. Yet subtle changes are already beginning to appear. On battlefields across Europe, commanders are experimenting with new tactics. Infantry formations are becoming more disciplined. Long-range weapons are becoming more effective. The knight remains impressive, but for the first time in centuries, he is no longer the only military force that matters. Most tournament spectators fail to notice. The knights themselves often fail to notice. But history has already begun moving in a new direction. And eventually, that change will reach the tournament field itself. The changes begin so gradually that many knights barely notice them. After all, tournaments are still crowded. Noble spectators still cheer. Champions still gain fame and fortune. On the surface, the world of chivalry appears stronger than ever. But beyond the tournament grounds, real battlefields are starting to tell a different story. The mounted knight remains one of the most formidable warriors in Europe. Covered in steel and riding a powerful warhorse, he is designed to smash through enemy lines with terrifying force. For centuries, that combination has proven devastating. Yet armies are evolving. Commanders are learning that discipline can sometimes defeat prestige. A peasant holding a spear may not seem impressive when standing alone. Place hundreds of those peasants together in a carefully organised formation, however, and the situation changes dramatically. The Swiss provide one of the earliest warnings. Their infantry formations, armed with long pikes, begin defeating forces that include heavily armoured knights. The sight is shocking. For generations, cavalry has been expected to dominate foot soldiers. Now disciplined infantry is proving capable of standing its ground. Then come the longbowmen. English armies demonstrate the terrifying effectiveness of massed archery during battles such as Crécy and Agincourt. Knights still fight bravely. Their armour remains impressive. Their courage is beyond question. Yet courage cannot stop every arrow. At Agincourt, mud, terrain, and relentless archery combined to create disaster for much of the French nobility. The battle becomes one of the most famous examples of how traditional assumptions about warfare are beginning to break down. The crossbow presents another challenge. Unlike the longbow, which requires years of practice to master, a crossbow can be used effectively with far less training. This makes military service accessible to larger numbers of soldiers. For many nobles, the trend is deeply unsettling. The medieval knight has spent a lifetime mastering horseback combat. He belongs to an elite warrior class that prides itself on skill, lineage, and training. Now, increasingly effective weapons allow ordinary soldiers to threaten opponents who once seemed nearly invincible. The implications are enormous. If infantry can stop cavalry, what happens to the social system built around mounted warriors? The answer does not arrive immediately. Knights continue to dominate tournaments. Noble culture remains centred on chivalry. Jousting still serves as a symbol of prestige throughout Europe. But a gap is beginning to form. The tournament field still celebrates the ideals of an earlier age. The battlefield is becoming something else entirely, and while knights continue perfecting their lance techniques before cheering crowds, an even greater challenge is approaching, one that will eventually make both the longbow and the crossbow seem almost gentle by comparison. The age of gunpowder is about to arrive. At first, gunpowder does not look particularly impressive. The early cannons of medieval Europe are noisy, unreliable, expensive, and often dangerous to the people operating them. They are slow to reload, difficult to transport, and nowhere near accurate enough to dominate a battlefield. Most knights probably view them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. And honestly, who could blame them? If you were an armoured nobleman whose family had spent generations mastering mounted warfare, it would be hard to feel threatened by a machine that occasionally explodes before firing. Yet history has a habit of hiding major revolutions inside minor inconveniences. During the 14th and 15th centuries, gunpowder weapons begin appearing with increasing frequency across Europe. Cannons are first used primarily during sieges. Their early performance is inconsistent, but engineers continue improving them year after year. Slowly, almost invisibly, the technology gets better. Stone castle walls that once seemed invincible begin showing vulnerabilities. Fortifications that had protected noble families for centuries suddenly face a new threat. This development alarms rulers far more than tournaments ever could. A powerful castle is one of the foundations of medieval aristocratic power. If cannons can destroy walls, entire military strategies must be reconsidered. And that is exactly what begins to happen. Meanwhile, handheld firearms also start appearing on battlefields. The first examples are crude. Some resemble small metal tubes attached to wooden poles. Their range is limited, their accuracy is questionable, their rate of fire is laughably slow. Yet they possess one enormous advantage. They can punch through armour. Not always, not reliably, but often enough to attract attention. For centuries, armour and weapons have evolved together in an endless contest. Better swords lead to better armour. Better armour inspires new weapons. The cycle continues generation after generation. Gunpowder changes the rules. Suddenly, a projectile launched by explosive force can threaten even heavily protected warriors. the implications are unsettling. A knight spends years learning horsemanship, combat techniques, and battlefield tactics. His equipment costs a fortune. His training represents a lifetime of investment. A gunner requires far less preparation. This does not mean knights disappear overnight. Far from it. Heavy cavalry remains important for centuries. Tournaments continue attracting crowds. Noble culture remains deeply tied to chivalric ideals. But a seed of doubt has been planted. For the first time, people begin asking questions that would have seemed absurd a century earlier. What if the future of warfare does not belong to the knight? What if courage, noble birth, and mastery of the lance are no longer enough? As gunpowder spreads across Europe, the battlefield starts changing faster than the tournament field. And the gap between the two worlds continues to grow wider with every passing decade. The arrival of gunpowder does not immediately destroy the knight. Instead, the knight does what warriors have always done when faced with a new threat. He adapts. Throughout the 15th and early 16th centuries, armour reaches an astonishing level of sophistication. Master armourers in cities such as Milan, Augsburg, and Innsbruck produce some of the finest protective equipment ever created. Steel plates are carefully shaped to deflect blows and projectiles. Every curve serves a purpose. Every piece is crafted with extraordinary skill. In many ways, armour enters its golden age, just as the age of the knight begins to fade. The irony is impossible to miss. Faced with stronger weapons, knights commission heavier and more protective armour. Breastplates become thicker. Helmets become more elaborate. Additional reinforcements appear on vulnerable areas. For tournaments, specialised armour becomes even more extreme. Jousting armour and battlefield armour begin drifting apart. A knight entering a tournament may wear equipment designed specifically for a controlled collision with a lance. Massive reinforcing plates protect the left side of the body. Helmets feature tiny vision slits. Some suits become so specialised that they are practical only inside the lists. The result is impressive. It is also revealing. The tournament is increasingly becoming its own world. Meanwhile, beyond the tournament grounds, warfare continues evolving at a rapid pace. Armies are growing larger. Commanders are coordinating infantry, cavalry, artillery, and missile troops together. Campaigns require logistics, engineering, and disciplined formations. Success depends less on individual heroics and more on cooperation between different military units. The battlefield is becoming a machine, and machines reward efficiency. A heavily armoured knight charging with a lance remains a formidable sight, but battles are no longer decided solely by cavalry attacks. Artillery softens enemy positions. Infantry formations hold strategic ground. Firearms become more common with each passing generation. The speed of change is remarkable. A knight from the 13th century would still recognise the tournaments of the 15th century. He might struggle to understand the battlefields of the 16th. This growing divide becomes increasingly obvious to rulers and military commanders. They continue sponsoring tournaments because they are popular, prestigious, and politically useful. But fewer people believe that tournament success automatically translates into military success. The knight is still admired, still celebrated, still respected. Yet the tournament field is beginning to resemble a stage preserving the traditions of an earlier era. And like many traditions facing an uncertain future, jousting responds by becoming even grander, more colourful, and more spectacular than ever before. As its military purpose fades, its role as entertainment is only beginning to grow. As warfare moves in one direction, jousting begins moving in another. The separation happens gradually. A knight attending a tournament in the early 16th century would still recognise much of the sport practised by his ancestors. Horses still thunder down the lists. Lances still shatter, crowds still cheer. Yet something fundamental has changed. The tournament is no longer preparing warriors for war. It is becoming a performance. This transformation is visible everywhere. Tournament grounds grow larger and more elaborate. Temporary wooden arenas become architectural masterpieces decorated with banners, painted shields, statues, and luxurious pavilions. Noble guests arrive dressed in silk and velvet. Musicians perform throughout the festivities. Feasts, dances, and ceremonies often last longer than the actual competition itself. A tournament is now an event. Sometimes it feels more like a festival than a military exercise. Kings embrace the change enthusiastically. For rulers, tournaments provide an opportunity to display wealth, authority, and prestige. A magnificent tournament demonstrates the prosperity of a kingdom in the same way a grand palace or cathedral does. The message is simple. Look how powerful we are. Look how wealthy we are. Look how splendid our court has become. No ruler understood this better than Emperor Maximilian I. He adored tournaments and actively cultivated the image of the ideal knight. Through books, artwork, and carefully staged competitions, he helped transform chivalry into a kind of living theatre. And theatre requires costumes. Tournament armour becomes increasingly decorative. Craftsmen engrave steel with intricate designs. Gold accents appear on helmets and breastplates. Some suits of armour resemble works of art as much as military equipment. The horses receive similar treatment. Colourful caparisons cover their bodies. Feathers, ribbons, and heraldic symbols transform them into moving displays of noble identity. Everything becomes more elaborate. Everything becomes more expensive. Everything becomes more ceremonial. Yet beneath the glittering surface lies an uncomfortable truth. The more tournaments focus on spectacle, the less relevant they become to actual warfare. A soldier carrying an arquebus does not care how beautifully engraved a knight's armour may be. An artillery crew is not intimidated by a particularly impressive feather plume. The battlefield continues evolving according to practical needs. The tournament continues evolving according to noble tastes. The two worlds are drifting further apart every year. Ironically, this period produces some of the most beautiful tournaments in history. Crowds are larger than ever. Royal participation remains strong. The pageantry reaches extraordinary heights. But sometimes a tradition becomes most magnificent just before it begins to disappear. And soon, a single tragic event involving a king, a lance, and a splinter of wood will shock all of Europe and accelerate the decline that is already underway. For centuries, jousting had injured countless participants. Broken bones were expected, concussions were common. Occasionally, a knight was killed. These dangers were accepted as part of the sport. After all, medieval and Renaissance nobles viewed risk as proof of courage. A tournament without danger would have seemed almost pointless. Yet in the summer of 1559, a single accident changed everything. The victim was not an ordinary knight. He was the King of France himself. Henry II loved tournaments. Like many Renaissance rulers, he embraced the ideals of chivalry and knightly glory. Despite the growing importance of firearms and professional armies, Henry remained deeply attached to the traditions of mounted combat. He participated personally in tournaments and took great pride in his skill as a jouster. In June of 1559, celebrations were held in Paris to mark a series of royal marriages and diplomatic agreements. The festivities included lavish feasts, ceremonies, and of course, a grand tournament. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The king had already completed several successful passes in the lists. The crowd cheered, Nobles watched from decorated stands. Musicians played. It was exactly the kind of magnificent spectacle that Renaissance Europe had come to expect. Then Henry chose to ride one more time. His opponent was Gabriel de Montgomery, an experienced nobleman and capable jouster. The two men lowered their lances. The signal was given. Their horses charged. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The lances struck. Wood shattered. But as Montgomery's lance broke apart, a fragment flew upward. A long splinter slipped through the king's visor and entered his eye. The crowd immediately realized something was wrong. Henry remained conscious at first, but the injury was catastrophic. Physicians from across Europe were summoned. Even some of the most famous medical minds of the age examined him. Nothing helped. For days the king suffered in agony. Then he died. The shock spread throughout Europe. This was not merely another tournament accident. Kings were supposed to embody stability and authority. If a ruler could be killed during what was essentially a ceremonial sporting event, people began asking uncomfortable questions. Was the risk still worth it? Military commanders already knew that tournaments were becoming less relevant to actual warfare. Now rulers had a vivid reminder that the sport remained just as dangerous as ever. Many courts began reducing their enthusiasm for large-scale jousting events. Some rulers restricted participation. Others shifted their attention towards safer forms of celebration. Jousting did not disappear overnight. But Henry's death became a symbol. A splinter of wood had done what countless enemy armies could not. It had pierced the illusion that the tournament belonged naturally in the modern age. And from that moment forward, the decline of jousting became much harder to ignore. By the late 16th century, the decline of jousting was no longer driven by a single accident or a single king's decision. It was being driven by history itself. The world that had created the night was disappearing. Across Europe, rulers were building larger and more professional armies. Medieval warfare had often relied on feudal obligations, with nobles bringing their own armed followers to battle. Now kings increasingly preferred standing forces that could be trained, equipped, and controlled directly. This shift changed everything. A medieval knight represented individual excellence. He spent years mastering horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the use of the lance. His value came from personal skill and social status. The new armies cared about something different: discipline, uniformity, coordination. A commander would often rather have 1,000 well-trained infantrymen who followed orders perfectly than a handful of noble warriors seeking personal glory. Firearms accelerated this transformation. The arquebus and later the musket continued improving. They remained imperfect weapons, but they became more reliable with each generation. More importantly, they were easier to train soldiers to use. Teaching a young nobleman to become an accomplished knight could take most of his life. Teaching a recruit to fire a musket required far less time. Kings noticed. So did military planners. The battlefield increasingly rewarded formations rather than individuals. Soldiers marched in ranks. Musketeers fired coordinated volleys. Pikemen protected them from cavalry attacks. Artillery supported both. Victory became a matter of organization. The age of the lone heroic warrior was fading. Not entirely, of course. Cavalry remained important. Noble officers continued serving in armies. Courage was still valued. But warfare was becoming a science as much as an art. Jousting, meanwhile, remained rooted in a very different vision of combat. Its central image was still two armoured riders charging directly toward one another. It celebrated personal bravery, personal reputation, personal skill, all admirable qualities, but increasingly disconnected from the realities of war. To many younger nobles, military advancement now came through service in professional armies rather than success in tournaments. Fame was earned through campaigns, sieges, and command positions instead of shattered lances. The centre of gravity was shifting. For centuries, the tournament field had stood at the heart of noble culture. Now it was becoming a relic, a beautiful relic, a beloved relic, but a relic nonetheless. And as the 17th century approached, jousting faced its final challenge, not defeat on the battlefield, but something perhaps even more powerful: irrelevance.